Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever and whenever you're watching this. This is History 493, Lesson 24, Prisoners. And, well, first off, thanks to Trevor and Aiden for your videos and reviews of the two books you each covered. Thank you very much. Enjoy. I'm actually really starting to enjoy this. I miss you guys in class, though. I miss the easier give and take. On the other hand, this is working too, at least from my point of view. Um, this whole lesson about prisoners is kind of an interesting one because it's a topic that often gets ignored in the historiography, but is very popular in in the popular imagination. Um, it gets missed in the historiography frequently because prisoners, by definition, aren't going to determine the outcome of the war. Their part in it is over. They've been captured, and they are very, very rarely, if ever, going to have any sort of impact on the course of the war any further than after that point where they become prisoners. On the other hand, in terms of popular culture, prisoner stories and escape stories are very popular. Um, you can probably think of a whole bunch of examples, but some classic films that come to mind, books and films, The Great Escape, The Bridge on the River Kwai, and if you're stuck in quarantine or socially distant, those are both movies worth checking out if you've never had a chance to see them before. Um, but so that I wanted to include this topic so that we could take a look at what is being done in a scholarly sense on a topic that has a popular interest, looking at this issue of prisoners. I should also add that's a topic that I've been involved with for some time. My undergraduate thesis that I did at Penn State is actually on Allied prisoners of war in World War II, and I had the privilege of working with William Doyle, who is one of the probably the most important, well, he's definitely the most important American historian of prisoners of war, who written several very good books. None of them showed up here because he doesn't do things specifically on World War II. He tends to be much broader. Going through the slides, if you're following along with the slides, and by the way, I realize that I forgot to post the slides for lesson 23. They're now up on the website as well, up on Blackboard. But moving on to course administration, no big changes here. You did get, hopefully, my email about grading. I am slogging my way through and getting caught up. I apologize for the long time it's taking. The biggest takeaway there is to please be submitting things via Blackboard whenever possible at this point. It seems like that's going to be the easiest way for me to catch up. There's just I don't have enough ink to print out everything and grade it and scan it, but I'm doing my best to get caught up there. Let's see, moving on. Oh, the summer and fall courses update. I wanted to answer some questions some of you have had or just provide some general information. At this point, all of our summer classes are going online. In terms of history, that will be Professor Harris teaching his History 201. I doubt any of you are still lacking that one, but if you are or know someone who is, this is your chance. That will be moving to online from its current in face-to-face iteration. Excuse me. And then we are offering an online upper division course, History 491 on the Arkansas River Valley. This will be taught by Professor Mike Stephen, dealing with issues of agriculture and labor and race in our local area. Well worth checking out. If you have questions, you're welcome to ask me or get in touch with Professor Stephen directly. He is in the directory, so give him a line, drop him a line. As of right now, all of our fall classes are going to go as planned, meaning if it's on the website as an online course, it's an online course. If it is on the website as a face-to-face course, it is face-to-face. And that's the plan we're going with. Obviously, all of us know who have made it through this semester thus far that such things are subject to change, even if we don't expect them to be. So there is a possibility, of course, that those courses will be moved online in response to the pandemic, but at this point they're as listed, subject to change. I did want to draw your attention to a few things. Number one, Philosophy 107, Introduction to Religious Studies. That is a brand new course that we'll be offering for the first time this fall. It will support the philosophy minor, which we're in the process of converting to the philosophy and religious studies minor. So if you have an interest in that, that would be a great course to experience, learn how religious studies scholars approach their discipline. Geography 491, Geovisualization. This is taught by Professor Brock Kilgore, who has taught a number of classes for us before. Even though this is a geography course, this does count as a history elective. Okay, I'll emphasize that again. This does count as a history elective. So you can take this course and it will fulfill a history requirement for your degree, for your major or your minor. What it is, it's a course in using maps and mapping technology in various disciplines. So you'll be in the class alongside political science and sociology and criminology and social work and art and music students who are all learning how to use maps to better convey the conclusions that they draw in their various disciplines. And of course, obviously, historians depend on maps. When I was an undergraduate, I had my Russian history professor was Professor George Entine at Penn State. And the first day of one of his classes, he came staggering into the classroom right before class was to start with just his arms full of rolled up maps, just probably a dozen of them. And he comes staggering into the room. He gets, drops them on his desk, and he realizes that there are no map hooks around the room. Somebody had taken all the map hooks out of the room. And he just looked around and he said, "How can you do history without maps?" And some of you have commented on the books you've been reading. How can you write a history book without maps? Well, you won't have to if you've taken Geog 491 in this fall. On the history side, we're offering 333, Professor Gahn's History of the Roman Republic. She'll be back from her sabbatical. I'll be teaching History 368, War on History. That will be a one-day-a-week class on Fridays. Professor Stephen will be teaching History 372, which is Modern China. History 491, Latin American History. That is going to be taught by our Fulbright scholar, who we have not yet identified, but you're welcome to sign up for that one. And then finally, Professor Gahn will also be teaching History 491 in Roman law, and that course will also count towards the legal studies minor if you're pursuing that. I did want to spend another couple quick minutes, if you will, talking about about college in the age of the pandemic. Most of you, of course, are pretty close to graduating if you're not actually graduating this semester, so it's something of a moot question for you, but you might have friends and family who are asking this question. Is this a good time to go to college with everything that's going on? And for me at least, and I understand that everybody's going to have an individual answer to this, for me at least, the answer is going to be yes. I think the disruptions to our economy have shown that the people who are going to be best protected from these sorts of changes are the people who have analytical problem-solving skills that come with a college degree, no matter what your major. It's an unfortunate fact, but right now, unless you are in the service sector in an industry or a service sector portion that directly supports life, like groceries or healthcare, a lot of those service jobs are going away, and we don't know when they'll be coming back. On the other hand, if you are working in a position, in a degreed position, for the most part, we are finding that these positions are carrying on remotely. Here I am. So, if you are not ready to finish this semester but are going to finish soon, I do strongly advise you, and again, I understand there are individual circumstances that may change this, I do advise you to finish out your degree. And then if you're looking at people, is it time to start college? I think the answer is yes. I really think that college is going to be increasingly a marker of security in a very changed world. All right, off my soapbox, but still talking about jobs. We've had a visit from a Foreign Service officer not so very long ago, but I wanted to re-emphasize this one, that there's just so many different things you can do in government service. And it just recently listed uh, all of these positions. And these are all positions for somebody who's in the Foreign Service. But you see, it's there's a wide variety. I mean, those all look kind of interesting to me, but maybe I'm just kind of that sort of person. The point is, though, that when you're working for a government agency, it doesn't mean you're doing the same thing every day. It means you're addressing a wide variety of problems and issues. And over the course of your career, you may very well move from office to office and have a chance to explore and experiment and to have a worldwide impact, or at least a national impact, on a whole bunch of issues. And the government's still hiring. Government's kind of important these days, right? The writing tip. Differentiating between a web page and material access through the web is important. If you are citing something as a web page, that means it was created for the web and that's where it exists, and you don't expect to see it anywhere else. Maybe you'd print it out, but its intention is that it be on the web. But there are a lot of materials that you're going to be using for your papers that you may access through the internet, especially now that we're doing so much research remotely, but are not web resources. They're not web pages per se, in which case you need to treat them as they are. So if you are looking up a newspaper or a magazine article or a journal article or a book, or a primary source or a picture or whatever you're looking at, treat that source as the kind of source it is, and only then do you tack on the fact that you accessed it via the web. If, on the other hand, it is actually a web page, go for it. If you have any questions, let me know. All right, moving on. Today we're talking about prisoners, and we've heard, if you haven't watched Aiden and Trevor's videos, now would be a great chance to take a break from me and go see what they have to say. It's up on our YouTube channel. And for next Tuesday, we're looking forward to hearing from Gabby and Corey about dictators. Oh, boy, just a cheery week we have coming up, huh? All right. So, Aiden and Trevor covered Gavin Dawes' Prisoners of the Japanese, the edited collection Prisoners of War and Their Captors in World War II, Building the Death Railway, and Nazi Prisoners of War in America by Kramer. So I'll be finishing up with Duran's Stalag-Luft 3 and Michno's Death on the Hell Ships. I'll start with Michno, Death on the Hell Ships. Oh, got a little glare going on there. There we are. And it's a hard book. It's not a pleasant topic in the least, and the details provided are challenging to get through, to say the least. But it's an important note because it's an important work because it addresses an aspect of the prisoner experience that is unique to the Pacific theater. As you'll recall from our general overviews of the Pacific, it is an ocean filled with islands. Yeah, okay, you probably remembered that, but Anyway, point is, really the only way other than air to get between those islands is by ship. And when the Japanese initially launched their expansion early in 1942, and conquered so many of those islands, places like the Philippines, the East Indies, Singapore, etc., they captured a large number of Allied personnel, but those prisoners were not where the Japanese needed them to be economically. The Japanese really didn't expect to capture a lot of prisoners because of their personal code of honor. They expected most Allied soldiers to die rather than surrender. So when they discovered that they had this large number of prisoners on their hands, they began looking for ways to make economic benefit of them by using these prisoners as slave labor. And they discovered that, the prisoners weren't where they needed them to be. Therefore, the Japanese, beginning early in the war and continuing throughout, made efforts to transport large numbers of Allied prisoners from island to island, sometimes back to the Japanese homeland, sometimes to the Asian mainland, to do mining work, to do manufacturing work, but sometimes also between islands, between island possessions, I should say, of the Japanese Empire. Drink time. All right, so given that that was going to happen, the question was going to be how. And the answer, probably not surprisingly, if you remember what was said about Gavin Dawes' Prisoners of the Japanese and building the Death Railway, the answer is going to be brutally. The Japanese had very little regard for the lives of their prisoners, and so the conditions on the ships were indeed hellish, so they became known as the Hell Ships, with Allied prisoners crammed into cargo holds with no bedding, with very little space, with minimal rations, little food or water, few opportunities to relieve themselves. And so the holds of the cargo ship became horrific and disease-ridden. Prisoners were driven mad by their conditions, and then sometimes left their fellow prisoners with the unenviable choice of killing their fellow prisoners who had been driven insane by the conditions, or having the Japanese guards open up the holds from above and fire randomly into the crowds of prisoners underneath to keep because the insane prisoners were loud and disturbing the Japanese guards. I'm not going to go into too much detail. If you want to follow up with Mitch No's work, you're welcome to do so. But the conditions are hellacious, and they were made even worse by the irony of friendly fire. One of the most successful Allied operations during World War II was actually the American submarine campaign against Japan. While early on it was crippled by poor torpedoes, as we've discussed earlier, as the war went on and torpedoes improved, American submarines decimated, and far more than decimated, since decimate means to kill 1 in 10. They almost wiped out the Japanese merchant fleet, sinking tankers, sinking transports, and essentially cutting Japan off from its rapidly acquired empire. And you can see where this tale is going. The Japanese, in violation of the Geneva Convention, which shouldn't shock anybody at this point, failed to mark the ships that were carrying American or other Allied prisoners of war as they were supposed to. And as a result, many ships carrying POWs were torpedoed and sunk by American submarines. This is an absolute tragedy that so many prisoners were killed by their fellow countrymen who quite often did not know that the ship they had sunk had been carrying prisoners. Sometimes they would find out as the ship sank, and some of the prisoners survived. Some would even be rescued by American submarines, but most often the submarine would sink its target and move on without ever having known that they'd sunk a prisoner transport. The Japanese also, and again in violation of the Geneva Convention and other rules of warfare, would combine ships. So they would pack prisoners onto ships that were already carrying war material, or sometimes even troop transports. Interestingly, Michno does make the note that when Japanese soldiers were transported on ships, their conditions were only slightly better than that of Allied POWs, and that's something that is often noted in cultural studies, is that the inherent brutality of the Japanese military was simply carried over and intensified when applied to prisoners of war. A very different situation than we find in Europe. All right, so with that note, we'll move on to Stalag 3, The Secret Story by Art Durand. And here, culture plays a very different role. The way the Germans handled prisoner of war supervision was by service. So the German army was responsible for Allied army prisoners. The German Navy was responsible for Allied naval prisoners, and in the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe was responsible for Allied airmen who were shot down and captured. Thus, you have Stalag Luft 3, which means basically prisoner of war air camp 3. So the Stalag prisoner of war camp, Luft for air, and then 3. Because the camps were run by the military, not by the Nazi Party or by the state, conditions were better than they might have been. the German military was very concerned about the treatment of German POWs, as we heard from the previous video talking about the retribution between Britain and Germany that took place at various points. So there's that concern that if Allied prisoners are mistreated, then German prisoners will also be mistreated. But also, especially in the Stalag Lufts, in the air camps, Hermann Goering, who was the head of the German Air Force, had been an ace fighter pilot in World War I. And he had a very romantic vision of the brotherhood of airmen left over from his World War I fighter pilot days. As a result, he made sure for much of the war that Allied airmen who were shot down were treated well in the Stalag Luft camps. This contrasts with the Nazi point of view, because even as the Luftwaffe is doing a reasonably good job of taking care of prisoners, the Nazis are talking about revenge. They're talking about the Luftgangsters, the flying gangsters who are bombing German cities. Allied airmen who were shot down and were captured by civilians rather than the German military often were killed by mob violence. They were lynched. There's a reason. One of the basic rules of survival they teach you in the Air Force is never bail out over a place you've just bombed, and for good reason, because the people you've just bombed may or may not be willing to follow the rules of war regarding you as a prisoner. Durand is focused on this single camp, which means that he lacks a comparative perspective. So you can't necessarily look at this and say this is what life was like for all prisoners of war in Germany. It's just about this specific camp. But it is very well focused. Stalag Luft 3 is the camp from which the Great Escape took place. And again, I recommend that movie if you haven't had the opportunity. It's well worth watching. It's not entirely historically accurate. They tend to create some composite characters, put people together. But most of what they show is incredibly accurate. And inside Stalag Luft 3, there was an overt and a covert life going on for prisoners. Overtly, the prisoners occupied their time with theatrical productions, with educational opportunities, with sports and recreation. In short, they were seeking to keep themselves occupied. Remember that some of these prisoners were captured in 1939 as the war began. Some of the British and other Commonwealth prisoners. Americans began arriving in 1942. And it's a long war when you have nothing else to do. But beneath that overt layer, there is also a covert layer going on of a camp that was obsessed with the idea of escape. So underneath that, you have forgery, you have tailoring, you have construction going on of fake documents, of converting uniforms into passable civilian clothes, making briefcases for somebody to impersonate a businessman instead of an escaped prisoner. And then, of course, you have the efforts to escape itself. Sometimes it involved simply walking through the gates, trying to do so in disguise. A couple of times they managed that by dressing prisoners as German guards and giving them wooden rifles, hand-carved, hand-whittled wooden rifles, colored black with shoe polish, and they would walk out with a group of prisoners and escape that way. But the most famous efforts at escape were the tunnels, so escaping by digging their way out of the camp. This was a massive engineering production combined with this incredible involvement in creating fake papers. And I'm gonna geek out a little bit, but what the heck? We're talking about things like hand carving rubber stamps out of boot heels so that you could stamp a document and make it look official. We're talking about hand lettering, hand inking documents to make them look like they were typewritten. And if you have the opportunity when this pandemic mess is over one way or another, the Air Force Academy up in Colorado Springs houses the Stalag Luft 3 archives, and they have some binders, and they're just amazing, side by side, actual original typewritten German documents and the fakes that were produced in Stalag Luft 3, and I can't tell the difference, down to the point of actually duplicating the errors in typewriters. So if a typewriter had a little bit of a missing letter, or it had a letter that tended to stick, or like the circle in the G was always filled in with extra ink, they would do that too on the documents. It was truly fantastic. So the escape, the Great Escape, took place, and here's where the Luftwaffe's point of view about taking care of prisoners and the Nazi point of view regarding taking revenge on them came into conflict. 50 of the 76 prisoners who escaped were executed by the Nazis, and the rest returned to camp. Actually, only three escaped successfully, and that more or less brought to an end escape from Stalag Luft 3, but there was still quite a bit of the war left to go, and therefore quite a bit of life left to live. The end of the story for the prisoners in Stalag Luft 3 is, excuse me. Sorry, I'm feeling a lot better, but my tongue still gets a bit sore. Getting better, though. Anyway. At the end of the war, as Allied forces began to approach the camps, the Germans tried to keep their prisoners from being recaptured and liberated. They did this by forced marches, and these are sometimes referred to as death marches, because by the end of the war, the German system had begun to break down in terms of getting supplies to, well, anyone, and of course prisoners were included in that. So towards the end of the war, conditions became very harsh in the camps, and the forced marches in the dead of winter to try to get the prisoners away from advancing Allied forces were deadly in many cases, and exceedingly unpleasant in even for the survivors. A word about sources, and this is a worthwhile one. Both Michno and Durand to a greater extent, because he's just incredible, but make extensive use of interviews and personal correspondence, especially for prisoners where very few official records are kept. Getting a hold of survivors is perhaps the only way to really tell the story. And that's something that we have to make note of in the historiography. Times are changing. The World War II generation is fast passing. And so books like Durand's and Michno's, excuse me, Michno's, in many ways can't be written anymore, because the people they interviewed are gone, and we have only their notes to rely on. Now, in Durand's case, we have a lot of contemporary documents that were kept in Stalag Luft 3 to fall back on. Like I said, most of them are stored now at the Air Force Academy, or at least copies of them are. But a book like Michno's will be very difficult to write in the future. And so, in some senses, that's kind of the end of that piece of historiography. That, except where Michno has preserved his own notes, we won't be able to go back, and unlike Michno, we won't be able to choose to ask additional questions. Well, that turned into a bit of a downer. Didn't mean it to, but I will say that these are a pair of remarkable books. Probably Death on the Hell Ships is amongst the darkest of the books we've had to read, and perhaps Stalag Luft 3 is amongst the lighter ones. Just because they made so many efforts to keep themselves entertained at the expense of the Germans sometimes. There's tragedy involved here, but there's some humor as well. All right, I think I'm going to wrap things up there for lesson 24. So we're flying along. I hope your papers are going well. I will be in communication with you, posting graded responses as I can. I hope to be entirely caught up with grading by the end of the weekend. And in the meantime, if you have questions, email me. Wherever you are, stay healthy, stay safe for you and yours. Talk to you later. Bye.